Without further ado, I'd like to bring to the stage Mr. Don Beveridge.
Thank you. It's really, really great to be back in Rapid City. Anytime you're in a city where when you compliment people who live there, they say, shh, you know you're in a good place. And that's very much the way I feel about Rapid City, South Dakota right now. Let's dive straight into it because I don't want to keep us from lunch. When I started talking to Ray about what I wanted to talk about or what I might talk about this year, we started talking about AI and particularly how the way that we should think about AI in property management is kind of changing. And the particular thing I wanted to talk about today is how it's reached a point where thinking about this technology as AI is not that helpful of a way to think about what it's doing. We don't, for example, talk about Salesforce.com as an HTML company or product. We don't talk about business intelligence as a SQL product. It's more normal for us to think about what the technology is actually doing. And in the case of AI, the thing that it's really doing in multifamily is it's delivering automation. And automation is a topic that's getting much more interesting. And if I kind of contrast how I'm thinking about this now compared to the subject of last year's keynote that I gave here on centralization, you're starting to see that the way that this is changing the multifamily industry or the rental housing industry is starting to sort of gather pace, and it means that I'm now starting to think about this trend differently, which is what I really want to focus on during this talk. I think these are now two very interrelated topics, the topic of centralization, which I'll explain in a moment, and also automation. And that's what I really want to kind of explore over the next just under 1 hour. Okay, so before I go on, for those of you that weren't here last year or who that don't know me, my name's Don Beveridge. I'm an industry consultant. I specialize in rental housing, particularly technology and operations. Each year, I publish an annual paper, 20 for 20, it's called. And what I do is, because it's difficult to understand what's really going on in rental housing companies, because they're all very, very different from one another, if you're really trying to get a read on what matters in terms of trends, in terms of new developments in the industry, you really have to go quite deep with the people that are making decisions about it. So each year I go through the end of each year, I talk to 20 different senior executives. They tell me what they got done in the last year. They tell me what they're working on in the year ahead. And this paper, which you can download at 20for20.com, is something that's now in its 7th year, and it informs a lot of what I talk about in presentations like this. So what I want to go through specifically is these 4 areas. I want to go back and refresh a bit on what's changing in multifamily operations. I want to talk a bit about where we are at the moment, where we've got to so far with AI adoption in the industry. I then want to start talking about what's changing about the way people are thinking about and even doing automation. That's where the really, really interesting developments that have been going on for the last year or so have started to gather pace. And then finally, I want to try and bring it back to some of the subjects that we've heard elsewhere in the conference, which is about how automation and new sources of data are delivering causality that helps us with things like maintenance. So those are the topics. Let's do a couple of working definitions off the bat. So what do we mean by centralization? Well, throughout this talk, I'm mostly taking the perspective of companies that run sort of 250, 300 unit multifamily communities. Those are big enough that they have a permanent staff of people in them. There's been a trend for a number of years to figure out how we take work done at property and do it in more central locations. That's what we mean when we say centralization. So what does staffing traditionally look like in these communities? Well, you've got, let's take our average 300-unit multifamily community. You've got 3 people in front office and 3 people in back office. So you have a maintenance team of 3, and you have a front office team that usually consists of a community manager who's in charge, an assistant community manager who does most of the administrative work, and a leasing agent. And the division of labor sort of administratively between the community manager and the assistant community manager, it usually goes along the lines of the community manager is like responsible for payables, and the assistant is responsible for receivables. So if you sort of, that's usually the helpful way to think about how they divide up labor. So let's talk about what's been changing in operations. Each of these tasks that I just described are varyingly good candidates for centralization. The objective really over the last few years has been to try and figure out how to move all kinds of work like this to the place where they can be done the most efficiently. If we look at leasing, when the whole centralization trend started, was really the thing that people were focused on. Leasing, it's where the revenue comes from, it's the sexy thing that people always want to talk about in multifamily. And, if we'd have been having this conversation 5 or 6 years ago, it was all about, well, leasing agents are going to become a thing of the past. Leasing as an activity is going to become fully digital and automated. It hasn't really played out that way. What we have generally found is that people have adopted more and more technology. But leasing is supported more centrally across multifamily organizations. To the extent that properties are close enough together, sometimes they can be podded into little regional organizations that can share leasing teams. But most of the time, if you walk into a multifamily community today, even if it's a relatively sophisticated one, most of the time you're going to find a leasing agent sitting in the property doing tours. Admin, I'll go into some more detailed information about this at the moment, but admin, there's no good reason to do most of this work at property. So move in and move out admin, payments, collections, evictions, month-end accounting, all of that stuff that has always been done by somebody sitting in an office at the property who's constantly interrupted by people coming in and out of the leasing office. That stuff has been moving off-site at a much more rapid rate than anything else. And then finally, maintenance. There's some degree to which some companies are centralizing operations, or at least regionalizing them. You may remember last year, if you were here, I went through the example of Avalon Bay, the public REIT, who've built what they call neighborhoods, where they completely regionalize maintenance operations. That's very much the exception and not the rule. For most companies, it's really hard to centralize maintenance. The work can't really be automated away in the way that other types of work can. So maintenance doesn't look a great deal different from the way it used to, but some companies are getting smarter about the way that they manage their resources across multiple different properties. We'll get into the tech side of it in a moment. But first of all, let's look at some data that came from the annual survey that I run each year. I went through some equivalent metrics last year. These have been updated with more recent information. If we keep our analysis to front office and back office, the way that people are changing roles is instructive, right? If we ask people, so one way to ask the question to find out about this is, have you moved any roles off-site? So are there any people who last year were working at a property and now are working somewhere else? And what we find is with leasing, the most popular answer is no. Like, most people have not done this. And again, even though people have been working on the leasing part of this for longer, the reality is you still need some leasing team members. You can automate a lot about self-guided tours, about AI-enabled lead nurturing, like whatever it is. You can automate a lot of things, but you still need some leasing agent capacity at a property, and that means you always still have leasing agents in property. There's no sign of any end for that. Most people have either made marginal changes, have modified some roles a bit, and a small number, and those that look more and more like an outlier, have actually moved leasing agents off-site. So if we look at property admin, the work that we predominantly associate with the assistant community manager, that's a very different picture. Most of the people have either modified or rolled out or removed property admin from at least some of their properties. So the other dynamic that you may remember if you're at last year's talk is in multifamily, you have a mixture of companies that own and operate properties and properties that third-party manage on behalf of institutional owners. So the reason why you don't get like unilateral adoption of this stuff is that it's often not the operator's decision whether or not they, for example, change the staffing model. So if you're Greystar, for example, with your enormous portfolio, it's still your owners that decide what you can do with your people at their properties. So property admin, in terms of progress so far, has been moving much more quickly. Perhaps more interesting is when you ask these leaders to speculate on what they think the end state is going to be for centralization. So if we look at leasing, the most popular answer is not sure. And again, this is a problem that people have been working on for several years now. So for most senior leaders to not be sure about what the end game is going to be tells you that there was probably more to this than they thought when they started in the first place. There's a lot of people think that teams will be sort of podded, so you share resources between properties. There's a growing feeling that what will happen is roles will just kind of get modified, like the lines between different roles will blur. I'll talk a lot more about this as we go through. But then when you look at property admin, by far the most popular answer is everyone sees this as being centralized or centralized where it's appropriate or centralized subject to ownership approval. The only don't knows were two companies who I can tell you had probably not thought about this as much as they ought to have. But property admin is very much a story of this will be gone, baby, gone at some point in the not too distant future. So just to finish off on what's been changing, let's talk about maintenance. I talked a lot in a lot of depth about this last year, but the interesting thing about these larger multifamily properties that's different, I expect, from most of your businesses is that maintenance, there are just these three guys in every property that do most of the work. So that means every time a work order comes in, you don't have a decision to make about who's going to do that work. There's somebody permanent in the property that does it, which means there's this very natural inertia behind changing anything or against changing anything about the way that stuff works right now. The other thing is, of course, is you can't automate the work away. You can't take unblocking a toilet off-site and do it somewhere else. You simply need people in a property to do this. The one exception to this was one company that has a mixed commercial and multifamily portfolio that's all in one city. For everyone else, the most they've accomplished is marginal change in terms of maintenance delivery. If we talk to people in this chart about what their plans were, like what are they planning to do about maintenance centralization, again, the most popular answer was this state of mind that you get a lot in multifamily that I call planning to plan. It's where an executive feels committed to the idea that they would like to do something, but they haven't quite got around to making a plan to do it yet. So this dynamic of planning to plan comes up frequently when you're trying to get a handle on how likely people are to do something. Next most popular thing is no plans, and one company had firm plans for 2025 of how they were going to go about doing this. So again, very, very difficult problem to solve. Some people think that this will, when you talk about the end state, when you talk about the opportunity, some people think that regionalization, I happen to agree with that, is a good way to reorganize maintenance for multifamily. Intake and processing we'll talk about a lot in a few moments. That seems to be a growing area of interest, but again, the most popular answer is, I don't know yet. So that's the state of centralization in terms of accomplishments and what people seem to be working on at the moment. Let's talk about AI adoption, because this has been around for a while in multifamily. The very first interview that I ever did for the very first edition of the 20 for 20 annual survey, which was back in October of 2018, during the first interview, the first interviewee had done a pilot of an application called Dynasty, which was subsequently purchased by Appfolio. What that tells you is this has actually been around for a long time, right? So back in 2018, people started to adopt or at least experiment with these digital leasing assistants. They solve the problem of you call a multifamily community, instead of going through to the front desk or to a call center, you get offered the opportunity to convert to a text conversation. Thereafter, you're chatting in text with an AI. What then happened, of course, was COVID, came shortly thereafter. So the natural trend was to start to figure out how to make things contactless, how to make everything self-serve. So there was a huge shot in the arm for not only AI, but also self-guided tours. Self-guided tours was really interesting. I know single family has been doing self-guided tours for absolutely ages. Multifamily was incredibly resistant, in spite of all of the evidence that it works really well in single family. Multifamily was very, very, very resistant to this until COVID came along, at which point everybody adopted it. So you had this combination of self-guided tours, like access control that was being deployed in buildings, and AI. This future of completely digital leasing, like self-serve leasing, started to really take hold. And as we saw on the previous slide, although lots of this technology got adopted, it's improved lots of things about the way that a function like leasing works. it hasn't really changed all that much about the way people organize or staff multifamily communities. If we talk about where we are today with the adoption of AI, I think it's worth thinking about things in terms of what is now mainstream and what the more advanced adopters of this technology are doing. And again, if we stick to our structure of maintenance, leasing, and admin, maintenance, probably the furthest people have really mostly got is in work order intake, right? So it's the layer of chat, like Max for Property Meld. It's the layer of chat that handles the work order and gathers much, much better information than a human would. Okay, the more advanced versions of this are when you're getting into triage and dispatch. So that's a much bigger lever for performance. And then what the sort of slickest companies I see out there are doing, they're doing the sort of follow-up and also sentiment analysis. So AI turns out to be an extremely good way of figuring out what people feel about the work that was done. Across all of these verticals, the thing that's really started to become common over the last 18 months or so is voice AI. So there are lots of use cases where it's just much better to handle a voice call than it is to divert something to text. Think about if somebody's driving a car while they're talking to you. Voice agents are really good at avoiding any kind of menus, like because the AI can intuit what you're saying, it can intuit what language you're speaking and so on. This is a really interesting layer that's starting to seep into lots of deployments right now. If I look at what's happened with leasing, well, digital leasing, we talked about, it's been around for ages, been around since at least 2018. The more sophisticated applications in the leasing process tend to be AI-enabled applications. So AI is actually taking you through to the point where you sign your lease. There's some companies doing that. Once you get into that business, another natural extension of this is lease auditing, like this problem of, do the details in my property management system match the details in the lease? That's another very, very good problem for AI to solve. Lots of free money to be had when you do that. And then on admin, which is, I think, the most interesting area of this as we look at how this is developing, the thing that everyone's doing is delinquency, right? So delinquency is nagging people to pay their rent, is a job that nobody likes, and it turns out to be a great fit for AI. As we move up the scale, people tend to start using AI for all kinds of other things. They start to use it for general service requests. It starts to become a bit more of a concierge for properties, and even renewal conversations are being handled by AI. And I'll talk in a bit more detail about that later, because that's a really exciting opportunity. So to go back to this point on delinquency, I see something very interesting that's happening now that people have been using this tool often for a number of years. Delinquency to me is starting to look like a gateway process for automation. If you think about leasing, which is where the thing that people have been doing for much more time in multifamily, like leasing stops when you lease. So it's a pretty circumscribed sort of problem for AI to be solving. Although delinquency on the face of it, like nagging people to pay rent, looks similar to nagging people to take a tour, it's actually different. I'm actually going to talk you through this thing that I've been seeing in terms of adoption through the last few months as I've been talking to some of the companies that are further ahead on this in the industry. It goes something like this. You're trying to centralize delinquency, or you're trying to move delinquency off-site and into shared services. You use an AI to do that, so you've got a team, typically a small team, that's doing delinquency on behalf of multiple properties where they're enabled by an automation. What happens is, fairly quickly, companies see that the model works, right? And as soon as you see that the model works, you have staff turnover in multifamily, you naturally start to find that the span of control of the team that's running delinquencies kind of starts to grow. So they're doing it on behalf of more properties. It starts to become something that gets rolled out across all properties, and then financial results start to get better, right? So you see that generally people are paying their rent more quickly, you're collecting more money. And then what you also start to see once you've been doing this for a while is that because, unlike leasing, delinquency is something that happens every month, you're now talking to residents. You're now starting to observe that the AI is learning stuff about your residents, that each conversation tells you something about this resident responds to calls at this time and not at that time, or it's intuiting that this resident is actually just a bit disorganized. If you prompt them, they'll pay their rent. Other residents have different problems that you have to deal with differently. But there's this level of sort of intimacy that with the resident that means people start to trust it, and people start to want it to do other stuff. So you start to find that related processes start to come into the purview of what the team is doing. So things like screening and evictions naturally belong alongside something like delinquency. So you start to have a broader scope of processes that people are doing. And once you've got processes working like this, what you start to see is that the people running these communities, they start looking for other things to automate in the same way. So, what at the start of it might attract a kind of defensive reaction, well, this thing's doing my job for me. By the time it's been doing it for a while, people are just like overdoing work like this. They don't want to do it anymore. And since it seems to work really well, since it already knows all this stuff about my residents, since they're kind of forming a relationship with it, why wouldn't you want it to do service requests for you and ultimately things like renewal conversations and, of course, maintenance? So this is I was describing this in an article that I published a week or so ago. It's like there's this cultural shift going on. It's almost like these kind of efficiencies become kind of fashionable at the properties that are adopting it. It's like they don't want to do this kind of work anymore. They trust the automated, centralized services, and it really feels like there's a bit of a cultural shift afoot that I didn't really see a year ago. And so if we think a little bit more about this cultural shift that we see going on, broad acceptance that we want to move work to wherever it can be done the most efficiently. It starts to feel annoying to be interrupted from doing admin work by residents, so focus people on the resident stuff and get the admin work somewhere else. When I talked about the mindset of centralization, which is very much about taking someone from here and putting them there and changing my staffing ratio, it's like that's not really the way people are thinking about it right now. It's much more about making the work better, and then all of the changes in staffing naturally follow. Centralization, what the point that I would put on this is, people know what you mean when you're talking about centralization, but this word doesn't describe very much at all about what's actually going on in an industry that's becoming increasingly automated right now. And as I said earlier, whereas Lisa stopped at the tour, all of this other AI automation is talking to residents all of the time, and that's where lots of the really exciting opportunities are coming from. All right, so before we talk more about that, let's talk about what's generally changing in terms of automation. Let's start off with a couple of working definitions. So take yourself out of the property and think about factories and logistics and all kinds of automated things. Automation is the use of technology to perform a process, a workflow with minimal human intervention, often redesigning the process itself to achieve better efficiency, accuracy, or scalability, right? So it's about figuring out what bits are highly repeatable in a process, figuring out what the best way is to get those things done, and progressively doing more and more of that stuff so that you drive these efficiencies. When we think about what's changing now in the kind of automations that are available to us, what I just described, you could apply to something like a production line, like a simple process where I just automate the inputs, the outputs, and the process, and it works the same way every time. I think this is quite analogous to the way that people have been thinking about AI, right? So if you think about AI as this widget that answers the phones for me, that's kind of what we're looking at here. But if we go from our simple production line to something that looks like an Amazon logistics center, an incredible robotics and AI-driven facility that's unbelievably efficient, the automation is not really just about all these individual widgets that do stuff. The automation is much more about how work is organized. And the thing that's really enabling some of the biggest changes that you see in this domain is the thing that people are calling agentic AI. Now, agentic AI has become one of those buzzwords that you see around the conference circuit all the time, like the dog washing stations apparently have agentic AI elements to them, like if you listen to the vendors of this software. But if we think about what agentic AI really means, it's any system that can take initiative, make decisions, perform tasks toward a defined goal without requiring step-by-step human instructions. That definition there is far more indicative of where the real opportunity of this technology lies. It's not in just the one production line that produces this one thing. It's about how the whole system improves in order to maximize all of the automation opportunities that are available. So if we kind of think about this in terms of delivering service to residents, rather than just we answer the phone, we allocate the work order, and so on, it's much more like the automation delivers the service consistently. It understands the context. That nowhere is that more important than in maintenance, as we'll talk a bit later on. It learns and improves. So most software is created so that when you design the software, you tell the software exactly what it has to do. With agentic AI, the actual software is improving itself, or it's making recommendations on how it improves itself. It's going to see many opportunities that we would not if we did not have access to this kind of technology. And then finally, it can propose decisions. It's going to be the case that it will make lots of decisions, execute lots of decisions as well. But getting to this point where you can propose decisions about what you should do differently as a business, that's where most of the benefit is going to be. A good way to think about it is that if you just think about how work is organized, if you think about management work in general in organizations, there are many, many, many activities that follow a process like this. You gather data from different business applications. You aggregate that data into reports, right? This is what business intelligence does for us, right? So when we have our weekly marketing meeting, we have our marketing dashboard, and then what happens is we make a bunch of decisions. So, the forecast for occupancy for our properties has dropped, and this now shows up in a report that we might look at every week. Okay, well, that now means that we have to make a decision about spending money in different places, for example, to generate leads. That's the way you can think of many, many different processes that work in this way. These are types of decisions and ultimately types of work that should really increasingly be automated in businesses. So if I think about how that's going to change things, it's changing the scope of what improvements are possible. So if I think about legacy automation, and by legacy automation I mean stuff that's been around for like a couple of years, and I compare it to agentic AI, which is much earlier in its adoption, but I can see it starting to gather pace. If I think about how it generally works, the way that we've been thinking about automation is that you've got a repeatable process. You hear people talk a lot about automate the mundane, automate the repetitive, and focus on the exceptional. Like there's all kinds of fortune cookie wisdom about automation like that out there. But that's typically been the way that we think about it. We tend to think about widgets that solve really specific problems. And that's not to be sniffed at, right? Because those have delivered a lot of value. I mean, think about the value that Max adds to Property Meld, like the fact that you've got immediate 24/7 uptime, you're capturing sort of perfect information on every work order, and you're being able to allocate work optimally and quickly. Those are really big benefits that we've achieved. Simply, just answering every call in a leasing office has been a huge win for multifamily. But if we think about how the mindset is in agentic AI, it goes much more like this. The AI executes a process. In executing the process, it gathers hugely detailed information that didn't exist before. And in that information, there are all these clues for how you can learn about residents, how you can learn about the outcomes of the things that they tell you about, and how that can make you make better decisions during a time frame when you can actually do something about it. The benefits of that are that, again, if you think about traditionally software, I've already decided how I want everything to work when we created this piece of software. Now you've got the AI telling you what your improvement opportunity is. It's going to challenge your approach to how tasks should be done. And it's going to proactively find better ways to deliver outcomes. There's a couple of good examples I'll come to before we finish. So that's what's changing about automation. Let's put some details around how the automation is working and how it's going to potentially really change the way that we view our operations. Good thing to think about is that all of these chat solutions generate an enormous amount of words, right? So anytime you ask an AI for anything and it asks a clarifying question, it just generates, whereas before you might have had a single word or a checkbox or something on a form, you've now got a whole string of conversation. And in that conversation, there are clues that tell you an enormous, potentially enormous number of things about your residents and what they think about their experience of living in your properties. Really, really big opportunity here lies in sentiment, right? So if we think about the way that we deal with sentiment in rental housing, you have to survey people to figure out how they feel about stuff. Now, the problem is, if you're trying to figure out something like what things make people likelier to renew, it's very difficult to get to a question about, well, how do I know whether this thing that happened during the time that this person was living with me is really going to drive them to want to move out or going to make them want to renew? That's a very difficult thing to structure a questionnaire to gather that information. So instead, if you've been talking to a resident throughout their time in a community, you just know an enormous amount of stuff about their service history, about whether they were happy or sad about stuff at a particular time. You know what their payment history is. You know a lot about what their interests are. So if you think about the kind of analysis that you could do that could give you insight into something like renewals, the AI can separate out of this people that told you, I'm moving because of my job. I'm going to look at the people who I think may have been discretionary in their renewal decision, and I'm going to find out from their histories, oh, well, it seems like there's lots of incidents of service-related stuff that comes up earlier in those people's tenure at the properties. You now know that if I act earlier on understanding this sentiment, then maybe I can start to change what their experience is like and make them want to renew. So again, if you think about the leap that we're going to be able to make from paper-based surveys where I have to go and generate the insights myself to go try and intuit what my residents think about my property. You go from there to having the complete history of everything they ever told you in digital format. The amount that you can know about your residents and what matters is going to grow absolutely enormously. Nowhere is this more applicable than in renewals, right? It's really interesting talking to companies about renewal conversations. Renewals accounts for half of any multifamily community's business, whereas we lavish enormous money, commissions, technology on attracting new residents into our building. The process for getting people to renew is typically something analogous to writing an increased rent offer and shoving it under their door. That's the route to market, 50% of the revenue for your business. Now, of course, lots of companies are getting more sophisticated about it than that, but there's always been this massive asymmetry between the amount of effort we spend bringing new people in the door and the amount of effort we spend retaining people in our properties. Now, when you talk to people about renewals and how they manage them, you get this really frequent thing that people tell you, which is, well, you really want renewals to be this in-person interaction because renewal conversations end up being about a lot of things other than just renewals. And you're like, oh, okay, say more about that. It's like, well, it's the time where, when you really talk to people about whether or not they want to renew, it's often the time where they're going to tell you about their maintenance issues that have been bugging them for a while, or their noisy neighbor, or whatever it is that's making them unhappy. And what that obviously makes you think is, why would you leave so much up to the renewal conversation? Why would you place so much on this transaction when these things have clearly been going on for quite a while? So what you find when people start to use automation to drive renewals, they stop thinking about it so much as a transaction, which is the way that it's always historically been, and they start to think about it more as a process, and in particular as a process that runs from the day the resident moves in to the day that you put the renewal offer in front of them. Now, sentiment plays this enormous part here because companies start to reconceive the renewal process in terms of what are the levers that I can potentially pull during the lifetime of this resident's lease that can make this, can lead them to a great decision at the end of this. And of course, much of this has to do with maintenance. Like most of the time, there's a lot of, again, when you listen to software vendors, there's a lot of talk about what we can do to boost retention rates. The reality is most people don't move because of anything you did. Most people move house because of life changes. But of those people that are discretionary, by far the biggest causal factor is going to be something to do with maintenance. The fact you never fix this dishwasher or like whatever it is. So again, if I think about how this development of agentic AI has the opportunity to start changing maintenance, if we think of the way that we've been thinking about AI recently in multifamily, we're mostly thinking about the automation of the intake of work orders. And again, that's a great innovation. It's a great fit for the technology. You get much quicker response times. You get 24/7 availability. You deal with peaks in demand. You get improved work order data. So it means that you're not asking maintenance techs to go find out everything about the work that you're going to ask them to do. All great additions toolkit of experience improvement. Well, if we think about the agentic AI mindset, the AI is becoming more like the project manager. Like it's not just the thing that does the rote task, it's the thing that gathers the information. It then finds out context that's going to allow it to start making decisions. So what you have companies that use AI to do intake, and they'll have policies like, well, an HVAC work order is an emergency, it has to be addressed right away. Well, increasingly, the AI can just go look at the weather, and if it's 70 degrees outside, it's a better idea to deviate from the policy and schedule that tomorrow morning because the resident isn't going to notice. The resident can feel heard. They know that their stuff is being taken care of, but we didn't do the emergency call out that we didn't have to. The AI is then able to make sure that the work got done. It can create the work order. It can follow up to make sure that work got done at the time that it did. Once it's confirmed that the work got done, it reaches out to the resident. When it figures out whether the resident is happy or sad, maybe that's the right time to drop the Google review request on the residents. It can make all of these decisions where it's really acting much more as the project manager as it is as the widget that answers the phone. And that's a consistent thing that you see throughout all of these different applications. Really big opportunities then start to be work order avoidance. I mean, it's kind of interesting because whenever you roll out a technology like this, it was the same with resident apps, like you get this bump in the number of people that are raising maintenance requests, right? Because the easier you make and the more proactive you make it to gather work orders, guess what? You're going to get more work orders. But the trade-off is that you get to schedule those work orders at a time that best fits the team and still delivers the experience. And overall, the outcomes are much better. So this is a much better trade if you're deploying the AI to be much more of a sort of decision-making engine. The stakes on this, I think, are really high, and I'm sure you've seen already this excellent report that Ray's been talking about for the last few weeks. We now know, from this analysis, we know that there are some things that have varying impacts on people's propensity to renew. Like we know that if we categorize things in terms of how likely they are to drive somebody to churn, even if it's like during the first 90 days of the lease, if we know that these things that happen within the first 3 months are going to affect you 9 months down the line, this is now absolutely the kind of variable that you should be using in terms of how we organize work. And this is exactly the kind of thing that I see agentic AI bringing to maintenance. I'm going to share one big paradigm shift that I see coming in maintenance technology as agentic AI becomes more and more common. If you think about maintenance technology, every single maintenance app out there in the market has been designed to optimize the operator's resources, right? It's about how do I manage the work orders? How do I manage my team? How do I deal with this work as efficiently as possible? How do I check that this work? It's predominantly to do with optimizing the resources of the properties. The mindset change that is coming, particularly as you think about renewals and being able to know far more about the impact that maintenance has on it, is that maintenance technology is increasingly going to be optimized from the customer experience outwards, not the other way around. That's a pretty big deal, right? So if you think about the stuff that Ray's been putting in the reports that we've been sharing over the last couple of days, you're really tying the requests that are coming in to the commercial outcome, right? It's the decisions to purchase that the resident is going to make that is driving the decisions about how you fix stuff in properties. And that's the way that the best service and logistics organizations that you can think of operates, right? DoorDash, Uber, Amazon Prime. Amazon Prime is an incredible logistical organization. It's all organized around whatever makes the difference to the person who's making the purchase. That's not the way that maintenance has ever been organized in multifamily before, but as agentic AI becomes more and more commonplace, this is going to be the way that winning technology works. So I will finish with a couple of general thoughts about what I think this potentially means for multifamily. I think what agentic AI in particular is doing to the nature of work is it's changing the number of things that we should consider as mundane. We talked about the work process where we gather information, we put it in reports, we have a meeting, we make a decision, somebody keys something into it. Anything like that, that is also now routine. Routine is not just picking up the phone and reading out the pet policy. Routine is, if I know, for example, that my renewal rates are going to be slightly lower because I'm negotiating renewals with residents via AI, the AI, that means that my occupancy is at risk, a few months down the line or 2 months down the line. Why wouldn't you have the AI automatically change your ad spend to go fill that gap that just got created, like in real time, rather than putting this lag in so that we can generate reports, have meetings, make decisions? I think work like that is going to start looking antiquated, and I think those are going to be the things that we start to think of as routine. It means that many jobs are going to get much more supervisory in their nature. I mean, there are roles that we'll need fewer of, but if you think about roles like marketing for larger organizations, it's less about reviewing stuff, making decisions, and typing them into whatever tool you buy your pay-per-click ads from. It's much more about supervising stuff that is predominantly going to be done by AI that is making routine decisions as we go. You're going to really see, and this is going to be a big change, I think, for multifamily, that information gathered through one process or through one system or through one part of your experience is going to become extremely consequential to another. I just used the example of if you're doing renewals, you now know something about the exposure of your rental units in the future market. That information is extremely consequential for marketing, and those two processes can absolutely work in lockstep and in real time in an environment where AI is doing the work. Of course, maintenance and renewals is the same. Delinquency and renewals is the same. All of these ideas that we conventionally think of as belonging in separate silos, they are each going to become far more interdependent with one another as we develop a fuller and fuller picture of our resident and the experience that they're having. And finally, of course, this is going to change what we want our people to focus on. We talked about this idea of it feeling culturally normal or fashionable or whatever to just want to start getting busy work out of the leasing office and to focus people more on the things that actually make a difference. This is a very natural evolution that we're going through, where we were thinking a while ago about centralization in terms of, I'm going to take this specific role and put it somewhere else. It's much more now about what is the busy work that we don't need to do here. Once we've moved that work somewhere else, what do we actually want the people to do at these properties? How many people do we need? What roles do we want them to do? What is the thing that's going to move the needle the most in an industry that is always ultimately about relationships? I will not keep you any further from lunch. Thank you very much.